Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to this edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia. This week, we continue our series addressing programs or organizations throughout the Commonwealth that are helping individuals navigate through evictions or eviction prevention initiatives. Today, our guest is going to be Mike McKenna, President and CEO of Tabor Community Service /LHOP, and he'll tell you more about that later, which stands for Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership. And I'm thrilled to have Mike on today because in full transparency, Mike and I have had the opportunity to work together in the past, briefly. And so this is going to be a great opportunity for us to catch up professionally. Welcome to PHRC Speaks, Mike. Glad to have you here.
Thanks so much, Adrian. It's great to be here. And it's great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tabor, talk a little bit about Tabor's history for me. I understand this organization has been around for quite some time.
Tabor goes back to 1968, so the heart of the civil rights era, and we were actually founded in response to a really provocative and important document that was written by a professor at Millersville University who was also a leader in the Mennonite Church. Her name was Grace Wenger, and she wrote this article called "No Room in Lancaster" that was holding up the mirror to her fellow white Christians who were refusing to provide housing to Black people in Lancaster County and who seemed to be opposed to integration of neighborhoods in Lancaster County. So she wrote this article, and the response was a fellow group of Mennonite leaders decided to get together and say, all right, let's change it. Let's do something about it. So they formed an organization that initially was buying properties, rehabbing properties, and making those homes available to Black and brown folks in Lancaster County. And they also went down the path of getting certified as a HUD housing counseling agency a few years later in 1971. And while they were founded by faith leaders, they really wanted the organization to have an inclusion and openness to anybody in the community who was facing housing challenges or financial challenges. And they also wanted to seek funding from various sources to make sure they could scale their efforts. So from the beginning, they sought funding from, various governmental entities as well as from the community, from private individuals, churches, and businesses. And to this day, we have that commitment to racial equity as part of our makeup. And we recognize that Black and brown and other people of color are disproportionately affected by discrimination in housing, and we need to pay attention to that and help knock down those barriers.
Even though I've heard some of the stories behind it, I didn't realize the entire story and how Tabor has used civil rights as their North Star, and that's what's kind of led their path. What counties are you currently serving? Is Lancaster, or are you also now in York?
Yes, thanks to the merger with LHOP, Tabor and LHOP together serve a two-county region. We have our home base in Lancaster County, and over the past few years have expanded those efforts into York County with both housing counseling as well as with the homebuyer program. And we do have a partnership with Lancaster Lebanon Habitat for Humanity on the financial education and the homebuyer side. And so some of the homebuyers going through the Habitat program in Lebanon County also receive services through our organization. So pretty small footprint in Lebanon, but an important partnership, so worth noting.
Let's talk a little bit about that merger between these two organizations. What were the synergies that led you to that merger?
It started with strategic planning. Both organizations happened to be going through strategic planning at the same time. We were recognizing that we were facing some of the same challenges, that the affordable housing crisis continued to be a threat to the well-being of everybody in our communities. And we looked at the service offerings that both organizations had, and they were not duplicative services, they were complementary services. But we recognized that we put those together, we would actually be able to serve the community with a broader menu of services, and we'd have a bigger voice and a bigger platform to really be advocating for the types of changes that we are seeking in our community to make sure that there is equitable housing and affordable housing for everybody in the community. So we started down that path of saying, hey, could this work? We looked at mission statements and we saw how aligned our mission statements were. We often came back to this idea of what was best for the clients that we were serving. And at the end of the day, we felt that we could better serve clients if we came together. And anytime there were any challenges in the conversation, we always came back to that. And all of us involved in the process were really rooted in this belief that was actually the LHOP tagline at the time, which is everyone deserves a place called home.
That's awesome. Tell me a little bit about all the services. Now that you've merged them together, what are the services that you offer?
So certainly we're doing a lot around homelessness. And that is everything from homeless outreach, so connecting with people who are living on the street, through a shelter that specifically serves families and veterans facing homelessness. We're the agency that provides the coordinated entry for our county's homelessness coalition. So, when people are first finding themselves homeless and looking to get connected to these services, that's that opening there. And then we also provide a variety of case management services that help people get back into housing as quickly as possible. And we directly manage some permanent supportive housing units and some other types of supportive housing environments. The next area is really around fair housing, which very well, better than anybody. That's the Housing Equity and Equality Institute that was originally part of LHOP. And that is providing a lot of education to landlords, to tenants, to mortgage lenders, to anyone who needs to understand the Fair Housing Act and the associated legislation here in Pennsylvania, and know what resources are available for people to be able to meet their responsibilities under the law, but also have their rights protected. And that's been a really incredible advocacy element for the whole community. There's also the Financial Empowerment Center that's really focused on helping people build skills and knowledge to overcome financial challenges. Often those financial challenges are housing in nature. So the big focus throughout COVID, of course, has been eviction prevention. So our housing counselors talking to both tenants and landlords to keep people in their homes. And we do that through a collaborative effort that you helped start, the Eviction Prevention Network, that has grown enormously due to the need with COVID. Another area of service is the lending arm of the organization. There is a community development financial institution, which is a treasury designation for organizations that do lending with objectives to serve the community and underrepresented parts of the community in particular. So there's two types of lending that happens. One is the lending for down payments or closing cost assistance. So when low to moderate income home buyers are looking to get into that first home, they're getting a loan at that time, and then the loan is paid back at the time that property is sold. So there's actually not any upfront costs to the borrower. The other type of lending is about creating more affordable housing. So there's a tool called the Local Home Housing Fund and Investment Fund and Trust, LIFT, and that serves actually an 8-county region, though most of the lending has been in and around Lancaster County, York, and Dauphin County. That's really to help close that financing gap for developers who are trying to make affordable housing part of a development or all of a development. Then the last area of our involvement in the community is really around coalition building and building capacity in others. So one example would be the SOWE initiative on the southwest part of Lancaster City. There's been a community development plan that was developed by neighbors, by residents of that neighborhood, and LHOP and now Tabor/LHOP are serving as the backbone entity for that collective impact project. So the plan was developed by the people who live in that community, and LHOP has really brought in a lot of resources, in particular from the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation, as well as local foundations, to bring that plan to life. And that has covered things like facade improvements and street lighting, on up through acquiring homes, rehabbing homes, and providing those homes for first-time home buyers, as well as some partnerships with the community school in the area, and lots of other projects that were really driven by residents. Another coalition aspect is the Coalition for Sustainable Housing, which is a group of developers, architects, nonprofit organizations, municipal officials, folks who care about housing for everyone in the community, all ages and stages of life, but in particular with an eye to affordable housing. And that group is really working on the policy environment, looking at how do we change the conversation about affordable housing? How do we fight some of the stigma? How do we look at challenges of zoning? How do we talk about property conditions and those type of issues? And that's really, I think, been an important collaboration to start raising the level of awareness about this issue and what some of the solutions out there. And then, of course, another coalition is the Homelessness Coalition. So Tabor LHOP is one of the lead agencies within that, as I mentioned, a lot of services. But we're working with our partners across the county to design solutions. And we've been doing a lot of innovative things throughout COVID.
Now, we mentioned the Eviction Prevention Network. So that brings us to the hot topic that is today, this COVID pandemic, the kind of partnerships that had to be formed or enhanced in order to be able to address what is going on. What can you tell me about how Tabor LHOP has evolved or involved other partners during this COVID crisis? What are some of the initiatives that have begun because of this?
So the Eviction Prevention Network started with originally 5 organizations around the county. And I think the initial seed grant was in the ballpark of $100,000 through PHFA, I believe it was. And we were looking at kind of 3 areas of support for landlords and tenants. There was landlord-tenant education and mediation. There was some subsidy for either rent moving forward or for arrears. And then there was some ongoing financial counseling or case management, depending on the partner, for the benefit of the tenant. We had a system that was working well. We were getting really promising results. We were seeing that folks were avoiding the eviction as a result of going through this program, and that the actual sort of unit cost per household was relatively low, especially when compared to some other types of emergency response, like shelters for people experiencing homelessness. So we knew we had a good model, and then we saw what was coming down the pike with the scale of the economic fallout from the necessary public health measures, but there was a real economic toll there. But we knew that those 5 partners alone didn't have the capacity to meet the need, especially when we were hearing reports like from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition put out a report that said nationally there could be 30 to 40 million people facing eviction. So we expanded that to 13 partners all over the county, making sure that there was representation for each sort of geographic area within the community. We were able to use the experience of the original network on kind of best practices for how to have those conversations with landlords, how to track the data and determine eligibility for tenants, how to make sure that we were leveraging the funds efficiently and creatively, knowing that we had many different pots of funding that came in through the CARES Act, through HUD, passed through to the city, passed through to the county. We had a local fund that was created by our community foundation and United Way that we received funding from. We also had private donors who were calling us up and saying, here's $20,000, please use it to help pay someone's mortgage or pay someone's rent. With all those different funding streams, we were able to consider eligibility a little bit more broadly while still adhering to the requirements of specific funding sources. And then shortly thereafter, the rent relief program was created in the Commonwealth. That program, of course, did have some challenges to it, but because we had this infrastructure, we were able to sort of pivot from our original funding sources to RRP to maximize that. We connected with our county commissioners to use some of their CARES funding to close the gap, make up the difference for landlords between what was allowed by RRP and what their true expenses and the tenants' arrears were. And then when RRP ended, we had these other funding streams to fall back on. Every single week, that group of partners gets together on every Tuesday. We're sitting down and we're saying, here's the latest guidance from HUD, or here's the latest guidance from this or that funder, or here's the feedback that we're getting from caseworkers, and this is a challenge that landlords are presenting, or this is what we're hearing from tenants. We're always problem solving. We're always trying to adapt to make sure that the program is responsive to the need as it changes. And we're tracking the data. So we're looking at how many people have been initially referred, how many people have then begun the case management, how many people have actually received some type of financial assistance. And we're able to see what the growth is. And then we're, of course, paying attention to the eviction data from the courts. There are, of course, evictions that have continued, even though the moratoriums are in place. Earlier in the pandemic, some of that was because of filings prior to. And then in other cases, it may be that non-payment is a factor, but not the factor. But we're still trying to make sure that our court system is aware of this network of resources, that the Bar Association knows, that other entities that may be involved in any kind of proceedings are aware of what resources are out there, so that hopefully a referral can be made, and hopefully we can work with the landlord and the tenant to ultimately avoid that eviction.
Absolutely. I'm curious to find out from your perspective how the program has been received by landlords. Do you find them accommodating? Are you having to circle back repeatedly? And is there a trust issue between the program? What are you finding?
I think it's a real mix. We were fortunate that Tabor LHOP already had strong relationships with landlords heading into the pandemic. There are many landlords, private landlords, and property managers who have rented to individuals exiting homelessness, or who have participated in landlord forums with the Fair Housing Institute. So those connections were there, and there's a level of trust that went along with both those organizations. There were also many landlords who were not aware of our services at all, and now because of the publicity around the need and the resources, they are aware. I think there were some genuine and legitimate frustrations with the rent relief program because the initial legislation did cap assistance at $650 and restricted landlords from working out various types of payment plans with their tenants. We are still, I think, affected by some of the lingering confusion around that, even when we have reverted back to other funding streams that did not have those type of restrictions. So we just find that we have to just keep getting the word out through every channel we can, both to landlords and to tenants. We are finding that landlords genuinely appreciate that there is some type of financial assistance involved. When the moratoriums come down, while it has a protective effect for the tenant and certainly has a public health effect, for landlords, especially smaller landlords who themselves are struggling financially or facing challenges, say, with a mortgage, the moratorium alone wasn't enough. But the moratorium plus some type of rental assistance, that can make a difference and make it a win-win situation for the landlord and the tenant. And ultimately, the goal is that that's a healthy, productive relationship between both parties. And we're trying, as the Eviction Prevention Network, to meet the needs of both parties.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of day one of this pandemic, when we all went home for the first time. And not letting the dust settle, you were sending and putting together a proposal for the CARES funding that was out there. I think that was day one of us being home. And next thing you know, we're all reviewing it and looking at it. And and it just kind of demonstrated the urgency of being able to get as upstream as possible, have the systems in place so that you can provide the help. And so I congratulate you for doing that, because I think it made a difference. And so kind of following up on that previous questions, we had read an article about a month ago stating that the funding had closed for rent relief and that a lot of the money wasn't used. And I'm wondering, what kind of impact did that have in your programs, or didn't it have an impact at all since you had so many other funding streams?
I would say Lancaster County, under the leadership of the County Redevelopment Authority, which was the lead agency designated by the commissioners in our community, we did an effective job of working within the parameters that we had. So we did reach about 530 households. We expended about 1.6 million. Our original allocation was 2 million. So as a percentage of the total, that was favorable. I think part of the reason we were successful was because we had that network of partnerships. We were able to delegate different pieces of the determination process to different entities. We also did have some funds from our commissioners, the CARES Act funding that the county directly received, separate from the HUD money that we had received for EPN, that was able to make up some of the difference. So for many landlords and tenants, we were not talking about a max of 650. We were talking about something that was considerably closer to what the true rental costs, of course, with rent reasonableness factored in. Mm-hmm. So that did help. I think what has happened is generally there's been kind of a patchwork of the policy response as it relates to housing. So we've had the CDC moratorium, we have the FHA moratorium, we've had a state moratorium, we've had our local courts doing their best to interpret all of the different guidance, and then we've had a lot of different funding streams. And we've tried to be consistent from the tenant and the landlord message of just reach out. We want to help. Just reach out. We'll worry about the behind the scenes of whether it's this funding or that funding. You just reach out. Of course, with the confusion and some misinformation that's out there, that can still be a very challenging experience for people. So we're trying to make it as streamlined. We are very fortunate. While the patchwork approach has been challenging, we are happy that the latest relief bill from Congress did include additional funding for rent relief. So the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, not to be confused with RRP, which was the previous state one, that one has a significant amount of money for Pennsylvanians. And Lancaster County, we just received word this week, it's about $16 million for rental assistance. And this time, Congress did something quite helpful, which was allow a reasonable level of discretion for local municipalities to design a program that works best for their community. And so thanks to the experience of the Eviction Prevention Network and the input of our partners and the relationship we have with the County Redevelopment Authority, which again is the lead on this one, we're able to take the lessons learned from those previous experiences and really design something that we think will hopefully be easier to navigate for tenants and landlords, hopefully a little bit more timely in terms of how quickly we can get out the funding and still meet all of our obligations under the law.
Another initiative that you had under COVID, and I think this is a direct response of some of the earlier calls we were receiving last year in March, that had to do with people that had already been evicted and were in a hotel. And now because of the state shelter in place, they weren't able to look for housing. So you have something called, let's see if I have it on my notes here, the quarantine hotel.
The quarantine hotel was part of the response of the homeless services system at the beginning of the pandemic, recognizing that people who are homeless are at greater risk for the virus and often at greater risk of complications from the virus, because many times as a result of the living conditions, they have complicated health needs or health needs that are perhaps not adequately addressed. And so we wanted to prevent the spread of COVID within the homeless population. So the Homelessness Coalition put out an RFP to hotels in the area. The hotels, as you'll recall, had just been cratered from a hospitality industry perspective in terms of, in Lancaster County in particular, we do have pretty active year-round tourism. Well, there was none of that happening right after, the pandemic really came to our community. So they were interested in providing help for this community need. And we were able to find a hotel that was willing to provide this service. And our outreach team will connect anybody who's showing symptoms, who is describing any of the symptoms, having a fever, just not feeling well. First connect them to a testing site, and then from there, our emergency management system would actually arrange transportation out to the hotel. And then there was a partnership with a few other organizations that were providing case management, meals, and then arranging for those individuals after either the test results came back and they had no longer had symptoms, or if they were COVID positive, then through the recommended period of quarantine. And then they were able to either return to shelter, or if they were individuals living outside, they'd be reconnected with the outreach worker. Ultimately, the goal with any of those interactions was to move someone along to permanent housing as quickly as possible. So that's still part of it. But in the short run, the quarantine hotel really serves a public health role. One sort of benefit, though, of having that experience since the spring is we're now in a position to expand the hotel-based shelter for the population that is homeless or displaced more broadly. So some of our shelter capacity shrunk because of the need for physical distancing and the need to mitigate the spread. There's been great dialogue among all the different shelters and other partners in the community. We also recognize through Eviction Prevention Network, increasingly getting calls, as you said, about people who were already displaced. They were paying their own way, but losing savings rapidly.
Sure.
That those folks needed to be bridged with a warm handoff to the homeless services system and all of the resources that are available through that. So through this partnership, essentially between the Eviction Prevention Network and the Homelessness Coalition, and a township that issued an emergency declaration to allow hotels to do an extended stay, we're going to be able to have a partnership with 2 different hotels in that particular township and a number of block of rooms at both that will essentially become shelter throughout the winter for people who are displaced, and for whatever reason, a congregate shelter would not be the most appropriate solution. So thanks to the experience with the quarantine hotel and the relationships we developed through that process, now we're in a position to kind of expand that and serve more people who will really benefit. And there's one client in particular who has been working with an outreach worker, had been unsheltered for some time. A few weeks back, when there was code blue conditions, so very cold conditions, we were able to get her into a hotel. And now several weeks later, things are starting to turn around for her, starting to seek
Excellent.
and consider other services, starting to consider reconnecting with family members, starting to truthfully start to heal from some trauma in her past. And that's the point of the housing first philosophy, is you get that stable housing in place, get a roof over somebody's head, and then some other things will start to fall into
Absolutely.
place.
Thank you, Mike, for joining us today and sharing your great programs. And please say hi to everyone when you go to the board meeting today or when you do it virtually. Think of them often. I want to take a little time to share a parting thought. Why are the topics we covered today important in the framework of fair housing? And I think we mentioned this a little earlier today. It's because these programs and others like it are an important part of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a federal obligation that municipalities that receive federal funding have. Everything from planning housing, building, renting, selling, financing, and zoning laws are covered under the Fair Housing Act. Remember, discrimination is subjective, meaning a person that is talked to a certain way or treated a certain way, that's subjective. And so when that happens, people have to have somewhere to go to be able to talk about that experience. So discrimination is more than just what you say to a person. It can also be policies and practice that have a negative effect on an individual within a protected class, like race or color, national origin, disability, religion, sex, or familial status. For more information, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in housing, visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 787 9780. That's all for this edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. Until next time, be good, take care, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.